The morning mist clung to the tangled underbrush like the breath of ghosts as Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant urged his horse forward into what soldiers called the Green Hell of Virginia. It was May 5, 1864, and the fate of a nation hung in the balance as 118,000 Union soldiers prepared to clash with 66,000 Confederate troops in the most unforgiving battlefield imaginable. Grant had crossed the Rapidan River with a determination that burned in his steel-gray eyes. Unlike his predecessors who had retreated after bloodying their noses against Robert E. Lee's tactical brilliance, this short, bearded general from Illinois carried orders from President Abraham Lincoln that were as clear as they were daunting. End this war, no matter the cost. The wilderness, a 70-square-mile expanse of second-growth forest, brambles and thorny underbrush in Orange and Spotsylvania counties, would become the crucible where Grant's resolve would be tested like never before. The forest itself seemed to conspire against organized warfare. Thick tangles of scrub oak, pine, and thorny vines created a maze where visibility rarely extended beyond 50 yards. Commanders would lose sight of their own units within minutes, and the dense canopy blocked out most sunlight, creating an eerie twilight even at midday. Veterans of previous campaigns whispered that this was where Joseph Hooker's Grand Army of the Potomac had been humiliated by Lee's audacious flanking maneuver just 1 year earlier at Chancellorsville. As Grant's massive columns snaked through the forest roads, Confederate scouts were already racing back to General Lee with news of the Union advance. Lee, the gray-bearded aristocrat who had become the South's greatest military mind, recognized the opportunity immediately. If he could strike Grant's army while it was strung out and vulnerable in the wilderness, he might achieve another stunning victory that could turn Northern public opinion against the war entirely. The first shots rang out around noon when Union cavalry encountered Confederate infantry along the Orange Turnpike. What began as a skirmish quickly escalated as both sides fed more troops into the growing battle. The forest erupted in a cacophony of musket fire, shouted orders, and the screams of wounded men. Soldiers found themselves fighting an enemy they could barely see, firing at muzzle flashes in the green gloom. Major General Gouverneur K. Warren's 5th Corps found itself locked in a desperate struggle with Lieutenant General Richard S. Ewell's Confederate 2nd Corps. The battle lines twisted and writhed through the undergrowth like living things, with units becoming hopelessly entangled in the vegetation. Officers on both sides quickly discovered that traditional military tactics were useless in this green labyrinth. Grant established his headquarters in a small clearing and began receiving reports that painted a picture of chaos. Units were becoming separated from their commands, men were shooting at shadows, and the forest itself seemed to be swallowing entire regiments. But as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the general who had earned his reputation with the simple phrase, "unconditional surrender," showed no signs of wavering. The first day of what would become known as the Battle of the Wilderness was ending in bloody stalemate. But Grant's aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Colonel Horace Porter, would later note that unlike previous Union commanders, who had shown signs of panic when facing Lee, Grant remained calm, methodically planning his next move. The forest had drawn both armies into its embrace, and tomorrow would bring a reckoning that would test every man's courage to its absolute limit. Dawn broke, gray and ominous over the wilderness on May 6, 1864, as smoke from thousands of campfires mixed with the morning fog to create an otherworldly atmosphere. Grant had spent the night studying maps by candlelight, his weathered face betraying no emotion as he planned his assault on Lee's positions. The Union commander understood that his army's numerical superiority meant nothing in this tangled maze. Where a few well-placed riflemen could hold up an entire brigade, the second day's fighting began before sunrise as Grant ordered a coordinated attack along the entire front. Major General Winfield Scott Hancock's 2nd Corps, considered the finest fighting force in the Union Army, moved south along the Brock Road while Warren's 5th Corps pressed forward along the Orange Turnpike. The morning air filled with the sound of drums and bugles as over 100,000 men prepared to resume their deadly dance in the green hell. Lee had anticipated Grant's move and positioned his forces with the tactical genius that had frustrated Union commanders for 3 years. Lieutenant General James Longstreet's 1st Corps was marching hard to reinforce the Confederate left, while Lieutenant General P. Hill's 3rd Corps held the center despite being badly mauled in the previous day's fighting. The Confederate commander knew that if he could hold until Longstreet arrived, he might deliver another crushing blow to Union hopes. The battle erupted with unprecedented ferocity as Hancock's men smashed into Hill's exhausted troops. Confederate resistance crumbled along the plank road as Hill's men, who had fought without rest for 24 hours, began falling back in disorder. For a brief, shining moment, it appeared that Grant's superior numbers might overwhelm Lee's defensive positions. Union soldiers pressed forward through the undergrowth, their battle cries echoing through the forest as they sensed victory within their grasp. But Lee's reputation as a battlefield commander was built on moments exactly like this. As Hill's line began to collapse, the Confederate general personally rode forward to rally his troops, his gray hair flowing beneath his campaign hat as he shouted encouragement to his wavering men. It was then that the distinctive sound of Longstreet's approaching corps could be heard, the rhythmic tramp of marching feet and the jingle of equipment that announced the arrival of the Army of Northern Virginia's most reliable striking force. According to historical accounts documented in Bruce Catton's A Stillness at Appomattox, Longstreet's arrival marked the turning point of the second day's fighting. The Confederate general launched a devastating flanking attack that caught Hancock's advancing troops completely off guard. The Union 2nd Corps, which had been on the verge of breaking through Confederate lines, suddenly found itself under attack from an unexpected direction. The forest erupted in chaos as Longstreet's men poured through the undergrowth, their rebel yells cutting through the morning air like banshee screams. Union soldiers who had been advancing confidently moments before found themselves caught in a deadly crossfire. Hancock's corps, the pride of the Army of the Potomac, began falling back in confusion as Confederate troops pressed their unexpected advantage. In the midst of this Confederate counterattack, tragedy struck both armies in the form of friendly fire. The thick undergrowth and poor visibility that had plagued both sides since the battle claimed its most prominent victim when Longstreet was accidentally shot by his own men. The Confederate general's wounding robbed Lee of his most aggressive corps commander at the crucial moment when the battle hung in the balance. As the sun reached its zenith, the Battle of the Wilderness had become a struggle between two exhausted armies fighting in conditions that resembled a vision of hell more than a traditional battlefield. The forest floor was carpeted with the dead and wounded of both sides, and the acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the metallic scent of blood to create an atmosphere that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. Grant received reports of Hancock's repulse with the same stoic calm he had shown since crossing the Rapidan. While his staff officers exchanged worried glances, the general who had captured Vicksburg and broken Confederate power in the West simply nodded and began planning his next move. The Wilderness was testing every ounce of his determination, but Ulysses Grant had not come this far to be stopped by a forest. The afternoon sun of May 6, 1864, cast long shadows through the Wilderness as both armies regrouped from the morning's savage fighting. The forest, already stained with the blood of thousands, was about to witness horrors that would scar the memories of every man who survived this green hell. Grant's headquarters buzzed with activity as messengers brought reports of the failed assault and Longstreet's devastating counterattack, but the Union commander's resolve remained unshaken. The most terrifying aspect of fighting in the Wilderness was about to reveal itself. The dense, dry undergrowth, littered with fallen leaves from countless autumns, had been trampled and torn by marching feet and artillery wheels. Sparks from musket fire and exploding shells found ready kindling in this tinder-dry carpet, and, by early afternoon, fingers of flame began licking through the forest floor. What had been a conventional battle was transforming into something from Dante's imagination. The first wisps of smoke appeared around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, initially mistaken for powder smoke from the continuing skirmishes. But as the wind picked up, the flames spread with frightening speed through the dry undergrowth. Wounded soldiers, unable to move, watched in horror as walls of fire approached their positions. The crackling of burning wood mixed with the screams of men, who faced a choice between enemy bullets and consuming flames. Confederate soldiers alike abandoned their positions to fight the common enemy of fire. Men who had been trying to kill each other moments before now worked together in desperate attempts to rescue the wounded from the path of the flames. The sight of blue and gray uniforms side by side, dragging injured comrades to safety, provided brief moments of humanity in the midst of unimaginable carnage. Lieutenant Colonel Horace Porter, serving on Grant's staff, would later write in his memoirs about the hellish scene that unfolded that afternoon. Entire sections of the forest became infernos, with flames reaching heights of 20 feet or more. The air filled with choking smoke that made breathing difficult and reduced visibility to mere yards. Soldiers stumbled through the burning forest like figures from a nightmare, their faces blackened with soot and their eyes streaming tears from the acrid smoke. The fires created tactical chaos for both armies. Carefully planned battle lines dissolved as units fled the advancing flames, and commanders lost contact with their troops in the smoke-filled maze. Artillery pieces had to be abandoned when their crews could no longer see their targets, and cavalry horses bolted in terror from the approaching inferno. The wilderness had become a burning hell that made organized military operations nearly impossible. General Lee, observing the conflagration from his field headquarters, recognized that the fires might accomplish what his tactical brilliance had failed to achieve: the complete disruption of Grant's offensive. The Confederate commander had built his reputation on his ability to read battlefields and exploit enemy weaknesses, but even his strategic genius was tested by the surreal conditions in the burning forest. Meanwhile, Grant faced the greatest test of his leadership since taking command of all Union armies. His staff officers urged him to consider withdrawing from the wilderness, arguing that the fires made continued operations impossible. Previous Union commanders had retreated from far less challenging situations, and everyone expected the general to follow established precedent. The Army of the Potomac had never had a commander who willingly remained in close contact with Robert E. Lee after suffering such losses. But as evening approached and the fires continued to rage through the night, Grant made the decision that would define not only his generalship, but also the future course of the war. Instead of retreating across the Rapidan River, as his predecessors had done, he ordered his army to prepare for continued operations. The man who had once declared that he would fight it out on this line, if it takes all summer, was about to prove that his words were more than empty bravado. The wounded from both armies lay scattered throughout the forest, some still trapped in areas threatened by the advancing flames. Medical personnel from both sides worked frantically to evacuate casualty stations that lay in the path of the fire. The sight of Union and Confederate surgeons working together to save lives, regardless of the color of their patients' uniforms, provided a stark contrast to the violence that had raged throughout the day. As darkness fell over the wilderness, the fires continued to burn, casting an eerie orange glow through the smoke-filled forest. The battle had cost both armies dearly. Union casualties numbered over 17,000, while Confederate losses exceeded 11,000. But the true test of leadership was yet to come, as Grant prepared to make the move that would separate him from every Union commander who had preceded him in the Eastern Theater. The pre-dawn hours of May 7, 1864, found the wilderness shrouded in an unnatural quiet. broken only by the crackling of dying fires and the groans of wounded men scattered throughout the forest. Both armies had fought themselves to exhaustion in 2 days of savage combat, and now the moment of truth had arrived for Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant. Every previous Union commander who had faced Robert E. Lee in Virginia had retreated after suffering such losses. But Grant was about to prove that he was cut from different cloth. The Union general emerged from his tent before sunrise, his uniform rumpled from sleeping on the ground, and his face bearing the strain of commanding over 100,000 men in the most challenging battle of his career. His staff officers gathered around him, maps spread on a makeshift table, expecting to receive orders for the withdrawal that military protocol seemed to demand. The Army of the Potomac had never remained in contact with Lee after sustaining such casualties, and everyone assumed that Grant would follow established precedent. Confederate scouts, hidden in the forest, watched the Union camps with professional interest, waiting to report the beginning of another northern retreat. Lee's army, despite its own heavy losses, had successfully held its positions and inflicted serious damage on Grant's forces. The pattern of Eastern theater warfare suggested that the Union Army would soon be marching north, licking its wounds, and leaving Lee free to pursue his own strategic objectives. Grant's first orders of the day shattered every expectation. Instead of directing his army toward the Rapidan River crossings that would signal retreat, he commanded his corps commanders to prepare for movement south toward Spotsylvania Courthouse. The general who had captured Fort Donelson in Vicksburg was about to demonstrate that the fighting in the wilderness had only strengthened his resolve to bring the war to a decisive conclusion. The reaction among Union soldiers was immediate and electric. Veterans who had served under George B. McClellan, Ambrose Burnside, and Joseph Hooker had grown accustomed to retreating after major battles, their morale crushed by the recurring pattern of advance, fight, and withdraw. When word spread through the ranks that Grant was ordering an advance rather than a retreat, spontaneous cheering erupted throughout the army. Soldiers who had been preparing for another demoralizing withdrawal suddenly found themselves energized by the prospect of continuing the fight. Major General Governor K. Warren's Fifth Corps received orders to move out first, followed by Hancock's battered but still formidable Second Corps. The Army of the Potomac, bloodied but not broken, began its movement through the forest toward roads that led deeper into Virginia rather than back toward the safety of Washington. Grant's decision represented more than a tactical choice. It was a declaration that this war would be fought to its conclusion, regardless of the cost. The Confederate reaction to Grant's movement was swift and decisive. Lee, the master of defensive warfare, immediately recognized the threat to Spotsylvania Court House and began shifting his own forces to intercept the Union advance. The race for Spotsylvania would determine whether Grant could maintain his offensive momentum or whether Lee could once again position his army to deliver another crushing blow to Union hopes. As the Union columns began their march, historical accounts from the official records of the War of the Rebellion document the transformation in Army morale that Grant's decision created. Soldiers who had endured the hell of the wilderness fighting found renewed purpose in their commander's refusal to retreat. The Army of the Potomac, for the first time in its history, had a general who would not be deterred by tactical setbacks or heavy casualties. The movement south required careful coordination as Grant's corps commanders maneuvered their units through the same confusing network of forest roads that had caused so much difficulty during the battle. The wilderness had claimed over 28,000 casualties from both armies, but it had also revealed the fundamental difference between Grant and his predecessors. Where other Union commanders had seen defeat in the heavy losses, Grant saw merely the cost of doing business in a war that had to be won. Confederate cavalry under Major General J.E.B. Stuart began harassing the Union columns as they emerged from the wilderness, but Stuart's troopers could not disguise their own amazement at the direction of Grant's movement. The Union Army was advancing deeper into Virginia, not retreating toward Washington. For the first time since the war began, Robert E. Lee faced a Union commander who would not be intimidated by tactical defeats or heavy casualties. As the sun climbed higher over the Virginia countryside, Grant's decision to advance south began, to reshape the entire strategic situation in the Eastern Theater. The Battle of the Wilderness had ended in tactical stalemate, but Grant's refusal to retreat transformed it into a strategic victory for the Union cause. The general who had promised to fight it out on this line, if it takes all summer, was proving that his words carried the weight of unshakable determination. The Wilderness had tested Grant's resolve in ways that no previous battle had done, but the general from Illinois had emerged from the green hell with his commitment to victory stronger than ever. The Army of the Potomac was marching south, and, for the first time since the war began, Confederate soldiers began to understand that they faced a Union commander who would never quit. The afternoon of May 7, 1864, found General Robert E. Lee studying maps in his field headquarters as reports arrived of Grant's unexpected southward movement. The Confederate commander, who had built his reputation on his ability to read enemy intentions and exploit tactical opportunities, faced a situation unlike any he had encountered in 3 years of warfare against the Army of the Potomac. For the first time, a Union general was advancing after suffering heavy casualties, rather than retreating to regroup and reorganize. Lee's strategic genius had always relied on his ability to predict and counter Union movements, but Grant's decision to continue the offensive violated every precedent established in Eastern Theater warfare. Previous Union commanders had invariably withdrawn after major engagements, allowing Lee to dictate the tempo and location of subsequent battles. Now, with Grant pressing south toward Spotsylvania Courthouse, the Confederate general found himself reacting to Union initiatives rather than implementing his own strategic vision. The race for Spotsylvania Courthouse began in earnest as both armies struggled to position themselves for the next phase of the campaign. Lee understood that if Grant could seize the vital crossroads, the Union Army would be positioned to threaten Richmond directly or to force another major battle on ground of Grant's choosing. Confederate forces, despite their tactical success in the Wilderness, could not afford to surrender the strategic initiative to an enemy who possessed overwhelming numerical superiority. Lieutenant General Richard Anderson, who had assumed command of Longstreet's corps after that general's wounding, received urgent orders to march his troops through the night to reach Spotsylvania ahead of the Union forces. The Confederate First Corps, veterans of countless battles, began their grueling march through the darkness, driven by the knowledge that the fate of the Confederacy might depend on their ability to win this crucial race. Meanwhile, Grant's columns were making their own desperate march through the Virginia countryside. Major General Gouverneur K. Warren's Fifth Corps, leading the Union advance, encountered Confederate cavalry at every crossroads and bridge, slowing their progress and buying precious time for Lee's infantry to reach their defensive positions. The running battle between Union infantry and Confederate cavalry created a confused tactical situation that tested the leadership abilities of commanders on both sides. The fighting on May 8, 1864, took on a different character, as both armies maneuvered for position rather than engaging in the direct, frontal assaults that had characterized the Wilderness fighting. Skirmishes erupted along the entire front as advance guards made contact, but the main bodies of both armies remained focused on the race to control the key terrain around Spotsylvania Courthouse. Grant's determination to maintain the offensive was matched by Lee's desperation to prevent Union forces from gaining a decisive positional advantage. Confederate cavalry under Major General J.E.B. Stuart played a crucial role in delaying Grant's advance, but Stuart's troopers were being pressed harder than ever before by Union forces that refused to be discouraged by tactical setbacks. The Confederate cavalry commander, who had built his reputation on daring raids and brilliant reconnaissance, found himself fighting a series of desperate delaying actions against an enemy who seemed immune to the psychological warfare that had been so effective against previous Union commanders. The strain of continuous combat was beginning to tell on both armies. Confederate forces, despite their tactical successes, were being steadily worn down by Grant's relentless pressure. The Union Army, while suffering heavier casualties, possessed the manpower reserves to replace its losses and maintain offensive operations. Lee faced the nightmare scenario of fighting a war of attrition against an enemy who could afford to trade casualties at an unfavorable rate. As reports reached Lee's headquarters of Grant's continued advance, the Confederate commander began to understand that he faced a Union general who would not be deterred by traditional Confederate defensive tactics. According to contemporary accounts preserved in the Southern Historical Society papers, Lee confided to his staff that Grant's persistence represented a fundamental change in Union strategy that would require new defensive approaches from Confederate forces. The night of May 8th brought no respite for either army, as both forces continued their movements toward Spotsylvania. Confederate engineers worked frantically to construct defensive positions, while Union forces pressed forward despite exhaustion and the constant harassment of Confederate cavalry. The Army of the Potomac, energized by Grant's refusal to retreat from the wilderness, maintained its southward advance with a determination that surprised even its own commanders. Lee's situation was becoming increasingly desperate as intelligence reports confirmed that Grant had no intention of abandoning his offensive operations. The Confederate general had built his strategic reputation on his ability to force Union armies to retreat after suffering heavy casualties, but Grant's persistence was neutralizing Lee's greatest tactical advantage. The Army of Northern Virginia, despite its battlefield successes, was being forced into a defensive posture that could not be sustained indefinitely. The approaching battle at Spotsylvania Courthouse would test both commanders' strategic abilities under conditions that neither had previously encountered. Grant's determination to maintain the offensive, combined with Lee's desperate need to prevent Union forces from gaining decisive positional advantages, was creating a tactical situation that would push both armies to their absolute limits. The general who had sworn never to quit was about to face the general who had never lost a major battle in Virginia, and the outcome would determine the future course of the war. The morning of May 9, 1864, dawned gray and forbidding. As both armies completed their race to Spotsylvania Courthouse, Grant's forces had failed to win the strategic foot race, arriving to find Confederate troops already entrenched in formidable defensive positions that Lee's engineers had constructed. With typical efficiency, the Union commander, studying the Confederate fortifications through his field glasses, realized that his opponent had once again demonstrated the tactical brilliance that had frustrated Union generals for 3 years. Lee's defensive line at Spotsylvania represented the evolution of field fortifications that had been developing throughout the war. The Confederate positions featured interlocking fields of fire, carefully constructed earthworks, and abattis, sharpened stakes pointed toward the enemy that would channel any Union assault into predetermined killing zones. The most prominent feature of the Confederate line was a massive salient that protruded toward Union positions like a giant arrowhead, creating what soldiers on both sides would soon know as the Mule Shoe. Grant's response to Lee's defensive preparations demonstrated the fundamental difference between his approach and that of his predecessors. Rather than seeking to maneuver around the Confederate positions or withdrawing to more favorable ground, Grant ordered direct assaults on the enemy fortifications. The Union commander had concluded that the only way to break Confederate resistance was through relentless pressure that would eventually overwhelm even Lee's tactical genius. The first major assault came on May 10th when Grant ordered Colonel Emory Upton to lead a concentrated attack on the western face of the Confederate salient. Upton's innovative tactics, which called for his troops to advance in a compact formation without stopping to fire, achieved temporary success by punching through Confederate defenses. However, the breakthrough could not be exploited due to inadequate support, and Upton's men were eventually forced to withdraw after suffering heavy casualties. Despite the failure of Upton's assault, Grant was encouraged by the temporary success and began planning a larger attack on the same section of Confederate line. The Union commander decided to mass an entire corps for a dawn assault on May 12th, believing that overwhelming force applied at a single point might achieve the breakthrough that had eluded Union armies for 3 years of warfare in Virginia. The morning of May 12, 1864, began with one of the most dramatic assaults of the entire war, as Major General Winfield Scott Hancock's Second Corps, numbering over 20,000 men, advanced through the pre-dawn darkness toward the apex of the Confederate salient. The Union soldiers moved forward in complete silence, their bayonets gleaming in the pale light of dawn, as they approached the Confederate positions that had been strengthened during the night. The initial assault achieved complete surprise as Hancock's men overran the Confederate first line and captured nearly 3,000 prisoners, including an entire brigade and its commanding general. The Union breakthrough threatened to split Lee's army in half, and for a brief moment, it appeared that Grant had finally found the key to defeating the Army of Northern Virginia. Confederate soldiers fled in panic as blue-clad troops poured through the gap in their defenses, but Lee's response to the crisis demonstrated why he was considered the greatest battlefield commander of his generation. The Confederate general personally led a counterattack designed to seal the breach in his lines, riding forward on his horse traveler until his own soldiers physically restrained him from charging into the Union ranks. Lee's presence on the battlefield inspired his troops to launch a desperate counter-assault that gradually began to push Hancock's men back from their advanced positions. The fighting at what became known as the Bloody Angle continued for nearly 20 hours as both armies fed troops into a battle that defied every conventional aspect of Civil War combat. According to historical accounts documented in Shelby Foote's comprehensive The Civil War, a narrative, the combat at Spotsylvania reached levels of intensity that exceeded even the savage fighting in the wilderness. Soldiers fired at each other across breastworks at point-blank range, and the carnage was so intense that an oak tree 22 inches in diameter was cut down by rifle fire alone. The struggle for the Bloody Angle represented the war in microcosm. Union forces with superior numbers and resources battling Confederate troops fighting with desperate courage on their own soil. Hand-to-hand combat raged across the earthworks as men fought with bayonets, rifle butts, and even bare hands. The dead and wounded piled up in grotesque heaps, and the ground became so saturated with blood that survivors would remember the red mud for the rest of their lives. As night fell on May 12th, both armies remained locked in combat that had achieved a level of savagery unprecedented in the American experience. The fighting continued by moonlight and torchlight, as neither side could afford to yield ground that had been purchased with so much blood. Grant's determination to maintain the offensive was matched by Lee's desperate need to hold his defensive positions, creating a tactical stalemate that could only be resolved by the complete exhaustion of one army or the other. The Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse was becoming a test of endurance that would determine whether Grant's strategy of continuous pressure could overcome Lee's defensive brilliance. The general who had promised never to quit was discovering that his opponent possessed a will to resist that matched his own determination to attack. The war in Virginia had entered a new phase where victory would go to the commander, whose army could endure the most punishment while maintaining its fighting effectiveness. The dawn of May 13th, 1864, revealed the true horror of what the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse had become. The Bloody Angle, where Union and Confederate forces had fought with unprecedented savagery for nearly 20 hours, presented a scene that would haunt survivors for the remainder of their lives. Bodies lay piled 3 and 4 deep in the muddy trenches, and the famous oak tree that had been felled by rifle fire alone stood as a monument to the intensity of the fighting. Grant emerged from his headquarters, tent to survey the carnage with the same stoic expression he had maintained throughout the campaign. His staff officers, many of whom had served under previous commanders, watched their general's face for signs of the doubt and indecision that had characterized Union leadership in the Eastern Theater. What they saw instead was a man whose resolve had been strengthened rather than weakened by the terrible cost of the fighting. The Union Army had suffered over 18,000 casualties in the battles around Spotsylvania Courthouse, losses that would have sent any previous commander into retreat. Confederate casualties, while smaller in absolute numbers, represented a proportionally devastating blow to Lee's already outnumbered forces. The Army of Northern Virginia, despite its tactical successes, was being slowly bled to death by Grant's relentless pressure. Lee, studying reports from his corps commanders, understood that his army was approaching the breaking point. The Confederate general had built his reputation on his ability to inflict decisive defeats on Union forces, but Grant's persistence was neutralizing every tactical advantage that Lee possessed. The Army of Northern Virginia could not indefinitely sustain the casualty rates that Grant's offensive strategy was imposing, and Lee faced the nightmare scenario of fighting a war of attrition against an enemy with unlimited resources. The weather, on May 13th, added another dimension of misery to the tactical situation as steady rain turned the battlefield into a muddy quagmire. Soldiers on both sides struggled to maintain their positions in trenches that had become water-filled graves for the dead. The wounded, many of whom had been lying exposed between the lines for days, suffered agonies that tested the limits of human endurance. Medical personnel from both armies worked under constant sniper fire to evacuate casualties from the contested ground. Grant's decision to continue offensive operations, despite the horrific casualties, demonstrated the fundamental transformation in Union strategy that his appointment had created. The general who had captured Vicksburg and broken Confederate power in the Western Theater was applying the same relentless pressure that had characterized his previous campaigns. Unlike his predecessors in Virginia, Grant understood that the war could only be won by maintaining constant pressure on Confederate forces until their capacity for resistance was completely exhausted. The psychological impact of Grant's persistence was beginning to affect both armies in ways that went beyond simple casualty statistics. Union soldiers, despite their heavy losses, were energized by serving under a commander who would not retreat in the face of tactical setbacks. Confederate troops, while maintaining their fighting effectiveness, were beginning to understand that they faced an enemy who could not be discouraged by traditional defensive tactics. On May 14th, Grant made the decision that would define the remainder of the campaign and establish his reputation as the Union general who would finally bring the war to a successful conclusion. Rather than continuing the frontal assaults on Lee's fortified positions at Spotsylvania, Grant ordered another flanking movement that would force the Confederate Army to abandon its defensive positions and fight on ground of Union choosing. Movement toward Cold Harbor represented more than a tactical adjustment. It was a strategic declaration that Grant would maintain the offensive regardless of casualties or tactical setbacks. The general who had sworn to fight it out on this line, if it takes all summer, was proving that his determination to win was stronger than Lee's ability to resist. The Army of the Potomac, bloodied but not broken, began its next advance deeper into Virginia. Lee's response to Grant's continued offensive operations revealed the Confederate general's growing desperation. The Army of Northern Virginia, despite its tactical successes, was being forced into a series of defensive battles that could not be sustained indefinitely. Lee's strategic genius, which had frustrated Union commanders for 3 years, was being systematically neutralized by Grant's willingness to accept casualties that would have deterred any previous Union General. The final lesson of the Wilderness and Spotsylvania campaigns was that Grant possessed the one quality that had been missing from Union leadership in the Eastern Theater, the unbreakable will to continue fighting regardless of the cost. The general from Illinois had proven that he would never quit, and that determination would ultimately prove more decisive than any tactical brilliance or defensive preparation that Lee could devise. The Battle of the Wilderness had ended in tactical stalemate, but Grant's refusal to retreat had transformed it into a strategic victory for the Union cause. The general who had promised to bring the war to a conclusion was proving that his words carried the weight of absolute determination. The Army of the Potomac was marching south, and the Confederacy was beginning to understand that it faced an enemy who would accept no outcome other than complete victory. As the armies moved toward their next confrontation, the significance of Grant's performance in the Wilderness became clear. The general who had emerged from the green hell of Virginia with his resolve strengthened, rather than weakened, had proven that he possessed the quality that would ultimately determine the outcome of the war, the unbreakable will to never quit, fighting until victory was achieved. The Battle of the Wilderness had revealed the character of the man who would finally bring the American Civil War to its conclusion.